Please God, we should be back soon. All right, I'm going to mute everybody and we're going to get started.
Okay.
Okay. So last week, the basic overriding theme, I think, was essentially, we are different from Europe. This week's theme is going to be, and we're dealing with the period between revolution and civil war, is going to be more of, I see how we've become who we are. Okay, that's the general theme for today. So in the early 19th century, Europeans were still experiencing the effects of racially fueled hatred, national sponsored discrimination, but in America, it was very different. In America, we had found a safe haven. Article 6 of the US Constitution guarantees on a national level, no religious test would ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States, meaning that Americans could take any role in government, including the presidency. And so Jews were in it, so that's the government level. But in addition, in many places, Jews were also welcomed and openly in the communities and by the general population. All right, and their integration in the community allowed them to live quietly and nearly invisibly. Indeed, they assimilated so well and intermarried in such large numbers that American Jewish life was in danger of disappearing. Jews were doing to themselves what the missionaries couldn't do. We've heard this threat today too. Despite the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, barriers to full equity in local and state governments still existed. Individual states had their own constitutions, as they do today, and some maintained discriminatory formal legal practices well into the 19th century. In Maryland in 1649, there was an act concerning religion, granted freedom of religion only to those who do not deny our Savior Jesus to be the Son of God. So Jews were rendered ineligible to serve in the state militia, in practice law, to hold any government roles at all. This is Maryland 1649. And it stays that way. It stays that way until the passage of what has become known as the Jew Bill, almost 2 centuries later in 1826. All right, and we're going to read some of that in a second. Until 1868, Jews in North Carolina were prohibited from holding political office, and not until 1877 were similar rules in New Hampshire finally overturned. So we're talking the late 19th century, post-Civil War, before Jews were in many states were welcome. So let's talk a little bit about the Jew Bill. All right, Jews needed to obtain political equality through a protracted effort. It wasn't a one-time and we're done, a struggle that had to be fought state by state by state. I'm trying to make sure I can be seen on this as well. Okay. As mentioned, the best known was the Maryland law. And so if you look at reading number 1, and I can't wait till at some point we're all in one room and somebody else can do the readings, because this is terrible, but I'll do the reading for right now, and I apologize, but we need to be here to, no, but if you, we could do that. Yeah, sure, come on up. We're gonna have somebody from here come up and read so you'll hear them, and it doesn't have to be me each time. A different voice is a good thing. Please.
You see them too.
You need a microphone? I can turn it on too. Go ahead.
Whereas it is the acknowledged right of all men to worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences. And whereas it is declared by the 36th section of the Bill of Rights of the state that the matter of administering an oath to any person ought to be such as those of the religious persuasion, profession, or denomination of which such a person is one, generally esteemed the most effectual confirmation by the attestation of the divine being. Who can even understand this?
This is 100 years, 150 years ago. Go ahead.
And whereas religious tests for civil employment, though intended as a barrier against the depraved, frequently operate as a restraint upon the consciousness And as the Constitution of the United States requires no religious qualifications for civil office, therefore, Section 1, be it enacted by the General Assembly of Maryland that no religious test, declaration, or subscription of opinion as to religion shall be required for any person of the sect called Jews as a qualification to hold or exercise any office or employment of profit or trust in the state. Section 2, and it be enacted that every oath to be administered to any person of the sect the people called Jews shall be administered on the 5 books of Moses, agreeably to the religious education of that people and not otherwise.
Okay, thank you. So I remember when I would teach the Melton class in the history class, we'd read the sections from the Talmud, and then I'd say, okay, let me tell you what you just read. Right. Yeah, so in a sense, just very simply, what was just said is Jews can hold office. Jews can take an oath based on Torah as opposed to putting one's hand on the New Testament. All right, so it was an opening of doors. All right, the Ashkenazic newcomers, that's where we're going now. They arrive in the 1820s and they're heirs to a relatively brief tradition of liberal ideas because they were exposed to the French Revolution. Prior to that revolution, European Jews were considered outsiders and subject to discrimination, violence, and expulsion. In many countries as well, you know, Jews were geographically restricted. They had to live in certain areas, subject in all kinds of terrible things. In the liberal atmosphere of the revolution, the debate opened. How should we treat the Jews? And we have it's a very famous statement by the Count of Clermont, and my French is non-existent, Clermont-Tonnerre, who said the Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals. All right, so as an individual, you had the right, but as Jews, we didn't, in the collective, we're not necessarily ready to reach out. But as a result of this, Jews were no longer considered second-class citizens, all right, legally, but nonetheless, old hatreds die hard. Real emancipation really took decades to implement, but you now had opportunities in business, in education, and in the arts. And so that's what's happening in Europe. And this is continuing over, by the way, into Germany as well. As we come here to America, most of the new arrivals who come to America, nonetheless, despite the reforms that are happening in Europe, want to recreate the kind of traditional worship that they had left behind in Europe. They're looking for, you know, when you walk into a new world, you want some of the trappings of your previous life. And so for them, the religious service maintained that. They looked askance at adapted homegrown religious practices that had developed in America. And they chose, because they were very liberal, they chose these new Ashkenazic Jews to come in and form new congregations. They didn't like the reforming that was going on. The synagogues began as traditional Ashkenazic houses of worship, reflecting the practices of their old country. All right, so you have now the Sephardic who've moved in and have begun to make changes. You have this new group of Ashkenazim from Germany in the 1820s who come in and say, I want my old ways, and form their new synagogues. And that had all sorts of implications. All right, far removed from the rabbis of Europe, nonetheless, and their scholarship and their scholarship of American Jews, they discovered this American ethos, and many began to make changes, even nonetheless, despite the best of intentions. So contrary to popular belief that Reformation of Jewish religion in the United States really didn't begin until the mass 19th century immigration from Europe. It really began earlier here. In 1824, as part of a local rebellion in Charleston's only congregation. Interesting name for a congregation, Beth Elohim. Rarely do you hear God's name in a congregation, certainly in anything but the most liberal of congregations. But Beth Elohim, it's a traditional Sephardic Orthodox synagogue in which that was the mode of practice and liturgy. And what you have are some of the members who petition for change. They are looking for two factors at this point. They want a shorter service, Yeah, we've all heard this. And they want the inclusion of English in the service. All right, to this point, the sermons, everything is in Yiddish. They want English to start to infuse the service. This petition is denied. And the group that had made the petition, led by the noted journalist and educator and dramatist, Israel Harvey, withdrew. You've got your first break off. They withdrew from the congregation and they established the Reformed Society of Israelites. November 21, 1825, Harvey is the first president of the shul, all right? And he delivers an address to the group in which he states the goals. And he says it's to promote true principles of Judaism according to its purity and its spirit. Hold that thought for a second, and I'll lay out a little bit what's being said. The reforms Harvey and his group instituted were the abolition of rabbinic interpretations, and 2, useless repetitions, and to read or chant with solemnity. Now that first piece, that abolition of rabbinic interpretations, we've heard this before. This is the byword of the Karaites. What they're really saying is get rid of the Talmud. Let's live the Bible by the Bible, not the rabbinic lens on the Bible. And if you haven't, you've read the book, The Year of Living Biblically, you want a humorous but interesting perspective on what that really means. It's worth a read, and I dare you not to come back with funny stories from reading it. One of my favorites is he walks around in the Bible, talks about the fact that you should stone those who are adulterers. And so he's taking this quite literally. He walks around with pebbles in his pocket, and you can fill out the rest. All right. Synagogues of the time were in constant flux. We now have, instead of one synagogue in a city, you have the sense of things are just in constant change. And so it wasn't unusual that the Charleston reformers, they then rejoined Beth Elohim, okay? This does not mean, however, that the debate ended. And the spirit of reform leads to changes in the congregation that included the following: confirmation classes for boys and girls, family seating, which means, like we're doing here in the sanctuary, men and women sitting together, all right? And the elimination of the observance of the second day of Yom Tov, all right? Again, the Bible prescribes one day. It's rabbinic that we added a second day, and there's also, I could go into the whole history of that, but just understand that we have a second day of Rosh Hashanah, a second day of Sukkot, a second day of Pesach. All in rabbinic interpretation is a response to the needs of the people at the time. 1843, another rift occurs. They have the audacity to introduce instrumental music. Okay, they have an organ. Now again, what is the premise of that? When the temple is destroyed, 3 things are forbidden in memory of the temple. One is instrumental music. The second is eating of any meat. You can't sacrifice an animal, you can't eat the meat. And the third is actually, believe it or not, congregational singing. You didn't sing in the synagogue. Now, needless to say, 2 and 3, eating meat, congregational singing, somehow we've gotten rid of. That's really disappeared over history. The one that was maintained is the instrumental music, and each congregation at this point in America has made its own choices. All right, I had never gone to a service with a musical instrument until I came to Brit Shalom, my very first time. All right, I actually would not go to a shul that had instrumental music. All right, I skipped out on bar mitzvahs, didn't go to bar mitzvahs because they had somebody playing the guitar. New experience for me, we all grow. So you have, and so organ music was also the first, and so the result is you have now, instead of the liberal members leaving, you have the traditional members leaving, and they form a separate synagogue. These early flirtations with reform, however, do not signify the formal establishment of Reform Judaism. That's going to happen later, but you see the seeds of such beginning here. New paths and practices to fit American sensibilities. In 1841, the rabbi of the congregation declares, taking it a step further, this country is our Palestine. This city is our Jerusalem. This house of God is our temple. And so you have early Reformed statements of this. We have no aspirations to return. This kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering. We have no aspirations of returning to Israel. This is our Israel. And that was the early Reformation, the theology, in a sense, of the early Reformation. If you go back to the prayer books of the time, you'll find no mentions of these hopes to return to Israel. It's changed. I mean, and you have Beth Israel and you have Emmanuel, and that was one of the key issues on which that they split here in Houston. Any comments or questions? I'll stop for a second. Yes, Rhoda.
Just to make sure, I think I lost the synagogue. Was it Levine that introduced music?
Yeah, after the reformers came back.
After they came back.
All right, they kept pushing. They introduced the music, and then what happens? The traditionalists leave. I will tell you, I'm often fascinated by Brit Shalom. I'm fascinated. Somehow we have managed to maintain one institution. We have people who come from the right who are leaving. There are people who will leave UOS and find their way here. We have a congregation of Reconstructionist Jews that folds, and they find their way here. And we somehow share a sanctuary. It's a fascinating demographic study, psychological study. All right, we've managed to do it.
Did they end up forming a synagogue after they?
Yes, the question is, I just want to repeat it. The question is, did they end up forming a more traditional synagogue? The answer is yes. This we're talking about in Charleston, yes. So the most widely known and respected spokesman of the American Jewish community prior to 1850 was Isaac Leeser, Leeser. Despite the fact that he made no claims to be a Talmudic scholar, he was not an ordained rabbi. 1828, he published a letter in the Richmond Whig, which used Jewish history to respond to an anti-Semitic article that had shown up in the London Quarterly, and this attracted the attention of the communities in Richmond and Philadelphia. He wrote this wonderful letter, and it was using text and history. And about that time, the Cantor of Mikvah Israel in Philadelphia died. And so Lisa was hired as the chazan of the congregation. And here we go. Here's where it starts. Despite ongoing disagreements with the trustees and the leadership of the synagogue, he had the determination to educate and organize American Jewry and to assert his own role as teacher and leader. Politics begin. Oh, I'm sure it was there before. Desiring to maintain Orthodox tradition and practice, he nonetheless understood that education and adaptation were necessary in America for Judaism to flourish. And he saw the behavior. He knew Jews were watching the Christian churches around them, their neighbors. And he was concerned about the lack of decorum in the synagogue. If you go into an Orthodox synagogue, and you can see on the continuum of Judaism, Eddie Feinstein once noted this, that if you go, the further you go to the right, the more chaotic the service is. Right? You go into an Orthodox synagogue and everybody's davening and mumbling, whatever. You go into a Reformed synagogue, everybody's sitting properly. Okay, and some with the conservative movement, somewhere in between, like on everything else. All right, that was Eddie's observation. But so what they were having was this sort of chaotic service. They're surrounded in a world in which the Christian world is very, very formal, and so he's worried about this perception of the Jewish service. And he publishes a periodical in which he suggests 4 rules for the congregation. You'll notice they're all decorum-based. It's not structural changes. All right, 1 is punctuality. Get here on time. I don't think he realized he was talking to Jews. 2 was silence. Going on, the rabbi banging on the podium. Controlling young children. There's a new issue. And remaining until the end of services. Right? By the way, which is you find that in the Orthodox as well, and it's a way of saying you don't get to leave unless you guarantee a minyan. You can't go to work. There's actually penalties in the European communities. If somebody left, the penalties were major because you had to make sure people could say Kaddish. He wrote There is no reason why a Jew cannot observe the Sabbath and the dietary laws meticulously and yet still be a cultured, educated person. By reading what he's saying, you're hearing the conflicts that are in existence. Okay. Many of these Ashkenazic Jews who arrived in the 19th century, they settle as well, in the large port cities of the East where they landed, but some, we're sitting here, made their way to inland to smaller but growing cities at that time, such as Rochester, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cincinnati. They entered into the business world, but in a manner different from their Sephardic predecessors, who mainly were merchants, and also different from the other immigrants of the time who basically spread out and became farmers. The new Ashkenazic arrivals, from Germany in particular, were mostly poor and uneducated. This is in the 1820s, okay? Little English-speaking ability. And so they tended, because of that, to live together in clearly defined areas of the cities. You've heard of the Lower East Side, okay? And they entered occupations which required little English ability or the possession of capital funds. And so they became garment makers, peddlers. You see the beginning of this early time of language skills and lack of capital. Again, I'll pause for any questions. Martin.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's appropriate now, but at some point, are you going to talk about when the word Orthodox actually appeared? Because it's not a traditional Jewish word, it's an English word. And so the word Orthodoxy applied to people who are more traditional, shall we say, appeared when in America?
So I wasn't going to address it, but I'm happy to. Okay, because it's a label. The question was, when does the term Orthodox appear? It's not the traditional label. And like most things, what happens is Judaism was Judaism. It had a range within it. When the ideas start to infuse the community, what you have is those on the right become far more fixed. All right, in response to an alternative perspective, those on the right become more fixed. I would say to you, my great-grandmother, who was an Orthodox Jew, would find Orthodox Judaism today foreign to her. So sometime in the 1860s, 1870s would be my guess, Martin. I don't know the exact date of but sometime in that period, as you'll see, that's a time of great growth of the Reform movement. The term Orthodoxy and the sense of moving further to the right really began. All right, is that fair? Makes sense to you, Martin?
Yeah. So another comment again, and I've made this comment before, and that is, you read the Maryland statute, and you think about what Reform Judaism has became over the years. The notion that Judaism is a religion alongside Christianity, which is another religion, versus Jews are a people, which is religion plus, is an interesting thing that we still argue about, and people don't understand fully.
So Martin, Martin's comment is he's noticing that based on the Maryland law, that the Maryland law defines Judaism as a religion as opposed to Christianity. But Judaism, Jewishness per se, the debate on religion, is it a religion? It's not a faith, I can tell you that. Is it a religion? Is it a culture? That's a 2-hour discussion and a great conversation for all of us to have. And I can tell you in advance, we won't reach a conclusion. All right, I can tell you that before we start. All right, but it does, the Maryland law, he's correct, is addressing Jews in a religious sense, for sure. All right. The original 23 settlers, remember we talked about they came to New Amsterdam in 1654. They were let off the boat on the premise it would not become a social burden, that they would take care of one another, of the poor amongst themselves. Now you've got competing congregations in the 1820s. And so before this, it was New York had a congregation. It was the role of the congregation to take care of the poor in New York. what happens once you have multiple congregations? Who takes care of whom? And so you have this dilution of community control, and Jews begin to create separate social and philanthropic organizations that are outside the direct control of the synagogue. You have organizations giving out free matzah at Passover, coal for the winter, burial of the dead if you can't afford it, education of the poor. These were seen as communal responsibilities. 1815, Rebecca Gratz founds the Philadelphia Orphan Asylum. 4 years later, in 1819, she helps found the Female Hebrew Benevolent Society to aid the city's impoverished Jews. So now you're starting to see Federation kind of organizations, JFS kinds of organizations, because the synagogue is no longer the only place, and there's competition. There are advantages to multiple synagogues. There are disadvantages to multiple synagogues, like anything else in life. Also, hovering over the Jews of this time is the threat posed. I'm sorry. All right, is the threat posed by Christian missionaries. Because what they're doing when you walk into a community of poverty, how do you get people to convert? You help them financially. Think of Gaza, right? How is it that the terrorists took over Gaza when Israel set them free? They made sure to take care of the needs of the people in an economic way. They had an election. Who gets elected? We're done. All right. With Jews, on the other hand, in this situation, took the opposite response. They realized this threat, and they began creating economic support systems so that they wouldn't be successful. And so as a result of the missionaries, the Jews actually became far more connected in response. Okay? All right. Let's talk about the growth of the Jewish population. We're going to start to move ahead a little bit from the 1820s. 1820, there's about 3,000 Jews in America. 1840, it's about 15,000 Jews. 1860, 200,000 Jews. That's the first real mass growth. And essentially, the increase stems mainly from a new flood of German Jews, another group of German Jews who are coming over. They're seeking refuge from the revolutionary strife that's happening there, worsening economic conditions, and repressive anti-Jewish legislation in all the German-speaking countries. This group, however, that comes over from Germany is different than the one from the 1820s. This one is more educated, more financially secure, and they're ready to create a new era in Jewish communal life. They bring with them a tradition of culture, of charity, and of reform Jewish practice, because reform is happening there as well. And they quickly find ways to incorporate those traditions into American life while maintaining a Jewish identity. In the professions, prior to this period, there were few lawyers or physicians in America, and certainly very few Jews. With the mid-19th century wave came professionally trained physicians in particular. And so you have, as a result of that, what was originally known as the Jews Hospital, now known as Mount Sinai in New York City. 1852 marks the beginning of Jewish-sponsored hospitals. It was originally founded for two reasons. One, to assure high-quality care for Jews, and two, to give jobs to Jewish doctors who've come over from Europe. Very pragmatic. And it ultimately evolves into a community institution that serves everyone. But its initial stage was literally called the Jews Hospital. I know growing up in New York, we heard of Mount Sinai all the time. It's part of the way we would talk about what do you call it here? Cancer. I'm drawing MD Anderson. It's part of our jargon. We just know, right? Mount Sinai had that same kind of reference. Jews begin to spread out. They move westward, they move southward. They leave the established Jewish communities, and they begin to form outposts outside of those communities. It's primarily young men looking for new fortunes, and many succeeded. Just like their counterparts in the larger cities, they begin their lives as peddlers, but eventually they settle in small towns and they open new stores. In time, these Jews and their children become respected members of their community, and the stores they open grow larger and larger and larger. And we know many of them. I'm going to throw out Macy's, but we have lots of them we know about today. This was the avenue in for us. Despite still some undercurrents of anti-Semitism, we found our way in these communities. There were Jewish mayors, there were Jewish sheriffs, there were elected officials. As a matter of fact, from 1820 to 1880, there were 20 Jews elected to Congress in America. Jews fought at the Alamo, okay? And they made their foray into the wilderness. Among the men and women who fell defending the Alamo in 1836 was a young Englishman named Anthony Wolfe, who served as a private in the Army of the Texas Republic. Wolfe was certainly the only Jew in the battle and is reputed to have been one of the last defenders to be killed in process. So we had a hand there too. That's Texas. You then have the gold rush. The gold rush pulls young Jews into the Pacific, where they open small shops and they service the miners who are coming in great numbers. Most of the 4,000 Jews who moved to California were single, young, and entrepreneurial men, and they cherished the company of other Jews. They were looking for some sense of familiarity. But like, I don't know where to make a joke here, but unlike the other 49ers, most Jews of the gold rush avoided the dirty work of the mines. You can write your own joke. They wanted economic stability, and they wanted the potential for family growth. Miners, as a general rule, would move town to town to town to town as they went in search of gold. And that's not really a family-friendly industry. These young Jews set up dry goods supply businesses. They founded Jewish fraternal clubs that in far-flung mining towns, San Francisco. Usually a few years later, after they settled in California, their siblings and their parents would come overseas and join them on the American West Coast as well. And they built substantive society that looked after its own, religiously, socially. They started kosher bakeries, boarding houses that served kosher meals. They established synagogues. They established religious schools, relief organizations, newspapers. All right. In 1856, Rabbi Julius Ekman of Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco's first synagogue published a letter in a Jewish weekly in Germany saying, it's a short reading, so I will do this one. The lure of gold, he wrote, which brought people from all lands in 1849, also brought with it a number of Abraham's progeny who have in the meantime expanded their population to such an extent that there is no town in California where not a few of our brothers are settled. The number of them in San Francisco alone is probably around 7,000. Now, if you think back to 1820, we talked there were 4,000 Jews in the country. There's now 7,000 Jews in San Francisco. Now, it's interesting. It's very interesting, the support systems that we developed. I noticed this. I spent 1 year living in Palm Springs. Palm Springs has two populations: the elderly and those who care for the elderly. Okay, and in a sense, what you're seeing are miners and those who care for the miners, and that's the role the Jews took. Let's talk a little bit about the sense of decentralization that's happening here in America. In Europe, central Jewish communal structures still were controlling the lives of the people there. But in America, Jews were supporting both secular and religious institutions and seeing that as a way of fitting in American life. They understood that belonging to these American associations was voluntary, but a positive way of interacting and finding one's way into the community. As in colonial times, Freemasonry continued to offer an opportunity for Jewish men to interact, with others in a supportive setting. Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise justified Jewish participation in fraternal orders. He said, Masonry is a Jewish institution whose history, degrees, charges, passwords, and explanations are Jewish from beginning to end. Nonetheless, as well you know, not every lodge was open to Jews. And so what you have is the formation of B'nai B'rith. We can't get into yours, we'll make our own. Founded in 1843, which historians called the secular synagogue. This non-synagogue-based fraternal, social, and philanthropic group allowed rabbis and congregants to focus specifically on religious practice, leaving the social and the philanthropic responsibilities to other groups. And over time, this array of organizational choice and commitment to communal services has become the hallmark of the American Jewish society. This is how, we have a crisis. I've watched this in Houston, it's fascinating to see. You have a Harvey. Federation begins a fundraiser. Federation provides dollars to the JFS to do the hands-on and to synagogues to do hands-on. There is a definite demarcation of responsibilities in response to a tragedy. All right, synagogue does its own fundraising in a sense, but in a sense that's just because we need to keep ourselves going during this time. But Federation takes on the larger picture of how do we keep the individual members in general. Synagogues do that too, but not to the degree. We're not going to raise $1 million for that, where Federation was able to do that. They have a larger population. Reading number 3, the founding of B'nai B'rith. Do I have a Vic? Rhoda, take this one, and you've got, Linda, you got the next one. You'll be ready for number 4. Reading number 3.
The founding of B'nai B'rith. The 12 men who gathered in the Sinsenheimer Cafe in New York City on October 13, 1843, were Jewish immigrants from Germany. Tired of the heavy-handed dogma that surrounded synagogue life, they founded an organization based in Jewish ideals that could unite all Jews in a fraternal setting. The Independent Order of B'nai B'rith, in a preamble to its constitution, stated its dedication to uniting Israelites in the work of promoting their highest interests and those of humanity, of developing and elevating the mental and moral character of the people of our faith, of inculcating the purest principles of philanthropy, honor, and patriotism, of supporting science and art, of alleviating the wants of the victims of persecution, providing for, protecting, and assisting the widow and orphan on the broadest principles of humanity. They formed themselves as a secret organization with regalia degrees and passwords, adopting rituals commonly used by other fraternal organizations. But by 1880, there were over 300 B'nai B'rith lodges throughout the country and with thousands of members.
Thank you. It would be interesting to do a study of the development of B'nai B'rith from its early stages to what it's become. That's another lesson, another discussion. You have an increasing number of European Jews arriving, and the cracks continue to widen in the once monopolistic synagogue structures of American cities. The earlier Ashkenazim, if you remember, were willing to ally themselves with the existing Sephardic communities, but cultural differences kept them from complete integration. Acculturated Native American Jews found the newcomers, these new German Jews coming, alien. They found them abrasive. They found them uncouth. The immigrants find their American Jews lacking Jewish religious observance. And so you've got new cracks developing in this process, and each congregation, therefore, that opens independently develops its own interpretations of what Judaism, how Judaism should be practiced. Further, I want to talk a little bit about furthering the influence, the lack of influence of Sephardic communities. During the 1840s to the 1850s, many Jews left the established Jewish community behind. As I said, they spread out all over America, and they opened new synagogues. And this demographic shift just continues to expand the Ashkenazic influence and reduces Sephardic influence. As congregations proliferated far beyond the East Coast, debates evolved about the importance of maintaining traditions while recognizing the need to adapt to new cultural influences. Conflicts and secessions. Sound like congregational life? Conflicts and secessions were common, and usually in these cases resulted in small changes at first, but slippery slope. You know what happens? From small changes come large changes. In the smaller cities with fewer Jews, religious observance tended to be, clearly, more flexible. People needed to compromise their personal practices to be able to survive in those larger communities. You know, and again, as you move, you find that. I'll just tell you, my own journey it's very fascinating. When I was living in New York, the first 30 years of my life, I was what I would consider to be in New York, a left-wing conservative Jew. My rabbi in a conservative synagogue was just not happy with my religious practice. I was far too liberal, and he gave me a lot of grief. I moved to Dallas, and they painted payas on me. All right, from the perspective of Dallas, I was now the right-wing fanatic conservative Jew. And I would tell you over the last 30 years from my arrival in Dallas to this time where even Sheretz Israel has changed greatly. Brit Shalom is far more liberal than the Dallas synagogue I arrived in 1987. Let me just clarify, 1987, okay? There is a continual shift to the left. I've gone from this liberal, my rabbi in New York, when I told him I was going to Dallas, said to me, "You're going to that liberal synagogue in the South?" That's what he said to me. "How can you go there?" All right. And today, that liberal synagogue in the South is no longer as right-wing as it was. Okay. And we've moved even further left. There is change. It happens constantly. As the century unfolded, you have an increasing number of newly acculturated children of German immigrants that are leaving the religious practices of their parents. And you see the emerging reform movement in America. Before 1840, that synagogue in Baltimore, in Charleston, Beth Elohim, stood alone as the one reforming institution. But just prior to the Civil War, there are other congregations that were previously Orthodox that generally agreed to the wishes of the congregants and adopted religious reforms. And by 1870s, there were few congregations in America which had not experienced significant reform. Many congregations were engaged in lively debate about appropriate ritual to follow, and you can see the reform movement becoming more popular. And it's in that world, Martin, that I have to guess that's where Orthodoxy would start to respond. Rabbis. All right, remember we said there were no rabbis. Abraham Rice is the first ordained rabbi to lead an American congregation. He arrives from Bavaria in 1840, and he becomes the religious leader of the Baltimore congregation. I had Baltimore in my head. Rabbi Rice quickly found out that Baltimore was not Bavaria, at least as far as rabbinic authority was concerned. Almost from the beginning, differences of opinion between the new rabbi and his congregants led to a contentious relationship. This learned rabbi was out of touch with the American conventions that had developed in the absence of rabbis. For example, when a large number of brethren of a deceased congregant conducted a Masonic funeral service, Rice raised objections, and he found himself rebuffed by the congregation. Rice tries to raise the level of Jewish education. He organizes an afternoon religious school for children, other cultural and congregational attempts to introduce modest reforms, and the result is a complete split. In 1849, Rabbi Rice realizes the futility of his efforts. He withdraws and goes and opens a store. Fortunately, not all newly arrived religious leaders had the same experience. 3 rabbis who understood American perspectives well enough to eventually significantly influence them were Isaac Meyer Wise, Dr. Max Lilienthal, and David Einhorn, all who grew to prominence before the Civil War.
What was the name of the one that came up?
Rice. Let me find this. Abraham Rice. RICE. Yes. Opened a store. I have a good number of friends who are in the Cantor who are now in the business world. It wasn't economics that drove the decision. We'll leave it at that. At first, each had to overcome the reluctance of their congregants to fully accept their leadership. That just was the way in a world in which there were no rabbis. American Jews were too accustomed to fashioning their own instinctive rules. In Europe, rabbis were the respected spiritual leaders and the undisputed arbiters of religious and cultural practices. In America, where congregational power rested in the hands of lay leaders, rabbis were now seen for the first time as paid employees. They were subject to the whims of a less educated laity. Rabbis like Weiss, Lilienthal, and Einhorn understood that to redesign the synagogue following the model of the Protestant churches with the pulpit at the front was a central feature. And I want to do 2 readings, one by Isaac Meyer Wise and one by Lilienthal. So Linda, you'll do the one, and who's going to do the second one? Any volunteers? I'll do the second one if nobody else wants to read it. Okay, so we're on reading number 3, Isaac Meyer Wise.
Isaac Meyer Wise. Although there was no single founder of American Reform Judaism, Isaac Wise is credited with organizing the movement. He arrived in the United States in 1846 to become rabbi of Congregation Bethel in Albany, New York, an appointment that was not without controversy. From the beginning, Wise was a force to be reckoned with, asserting rights as a rabbi at a time when laymen ran American congregations in a manner largely ignorant of the niceties of Jewish law. He instituted the use of family pews, abolishing separate seating for women, counted women in the minyan, gave sermons in English, and presided over confirmation ceremonies. After enduring a series of conflicts with the congregation, including a punch on the nose delivered on the bema on Rosh Hashanah by the congregation president, Wise assumed the new pulpit at Congregation on Sheavet.
Thank you. Is there more?
Yeah, there's more.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. After nearly 8 years in Albany, Wise was named rabbi of Congregation B'nai Yeshurun in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he spent the last 46 years of his life. In 1857, he published a new prayer book, Minhag America, in both English and German editions, which was widely used. He hoped that all American congregations would adopt, leading to a through a country that would unite all American Jews under a single religious umbrella. In this, he was not totally successful, as more traditional congregations rejected the idea. Certainly, though, Rabbi Wise attracted a large following among the upwardly mobile, rapidly Americanizing Jewish burghers who were his people. In 1873, Wise created the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, uniting 34 Reformed congregations. 2 years later, his drive for an American rabbinical school became a reality with the establishment of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati with 13 students.
See here at the beginning of the Reform, Isaac Meyer Wise is a significant point. I also like these makes about, well, he's trying to unite everyone. We're all Jews. You see this in the Hasidic world today, or Chabad. As long as you do it my way, Right. Everybody has, yeah, we're all Jews. Stop with this other stuff. Do it my way and we can all be Jews together. It's a lovely thought. All right, Lilienthal. Dr. Lilienthal's reputation in Europe had preceded him to America. A graduate of the University of Munich, he was made principal of a Jewish school in Riga, Latvia in 1839. Induced by the Russian government to help establish schools throughout the country that would teach Jewish students secular and religious subjects, he soon discovered that the ulterior motive of the Russian government was not benevolence, but conversion. In disgust, he left for America. In an unusual arrangement upon his arrival, due to financial considerations, 3 German congregations in New York hired him as their joint rabbi. In the sermon on the occasion of his installation, he noted that Judaism was split at present into 2 parties. The one exclaims, "Hold fast to the ancient institutions," while the other says, "Onward. Onward is our motto. Onward is the watchword of our times." He called for the support of schools to provide religious education to children and told his congregants it was his duty to introduce order and quorum into our houses of worship. He quickly devised a rotating system that allowed members of all the synagogues to assemble on the Sabbath to hear his sermons. Like Rabbi Wise, Dr. Lilienthal underwent an American baptism by fire before his leadership became accepted. But ultimately, both these rabbis legitimized new modes of Jewish practice that enabled congregants to feel that Jewish observance did not have to undermine American respectability. Under Einhorn's outspoken liberal leadership, the nation's first strictly Reformed congregation began to make major changes in its practice. He composed the creative prayer book Olat Tamid, which removed all references to Zion, to the Yom Kippur Kol Nidre prayer, we got rid of Kol Nidre, and the Musaf service for Shabbat and weekdays. That also doesn't exist in the Reform services. In 1894, his prayer book became the model for the Reform movement's classic Union prayer book. I do like I'm trying to imagine being in shul and seeing the rabbi and president punching each other in the nose, and it's like, oh God. It's not a spiritual experience anymore. And Rhoda's just like, I don't want to talk about it. All right. The rise of Reform Judaism in Germany led to a series of rabbinical conferences in 1844, 1845, 1846, in which they tried to standardize religious practices. And this carried over into America. The Philadelphia Conference of 1869 created the classical Reform period of a universal and scientific approach to Judaism. The Pittsburgh Conference of 1885 really began circulating for all the ideas and centralizing the ideas of the previous 2 generations. I'm going to read number 5, we're a little short on time. We consider ourselves no longer a nation. No longer a nation. And this addresses some of what Martin was saying. Religious community, therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a return to sacrificial worship. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinic laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. We accept as binding only the Torah's moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives. That is, I had a long conversation with Shelley Zimmerman, who was led at UHC, was the chancellor there, and he described that is the Reform movement. Ritual is optional, moral is obligated in terms of the laws of Torah. Despite the wide differences in theology and ritual, by 1880, 90% of American congregations were Reformed. 90%. Their practices and beliefs varied greatly one to another, but it would be fair and safe to say that the umbrella of Reformed Judaism in America essentially covered any congregation that was not Orthodox. You Orthodox or you were Reformed. That's the two categories, and it was 90% Reformed. The emergence and spread of Reformed Judaism in the 19th century America demonstrated just how much American Jewry was changing. One of those significant changes is the emergence of women. Women were gradually becoming more visible in religious life. And while it would take, obviously, most of the century to reach a sense of equality of women in a Reformed synagogue, they nonetheless were becoming active in the synagogues through sisterhood organizations that originated in 1887 in New York's Temple Emmanuel, and by the end of the century had taken root in nearly every Reformed synagogue in America. Sisterhoods, ladies' auxiliaries took root ultimately in Orthodox and conservative synagogues as well. 1893, Chana Solomon founds the National Council of Jewish Women, which provides leadership opportunities for women while attending to the charitable needs of Eastern European immigrants who start to come over at that time. In addition, women of renown, Rebecca Gratz is the creator of the first Jewish Sunday school. Henrietta Zold, the founder of Hadassah. Many women are taking a role for the first time. They're being permitted to take a role for the first time. They were the founders of labor unions and hospitals. We'll talk about that when we get into the time of labor strife. Women were at the forefront of educational activities, and they served as teachers and fundraisers. So I did something interesting this morning. I sat with my notes, and I went through all this, and I said, okay, what are the changes that we were looking at that I just described? Let me put a list together. This is where, from the European experience, end of the year, this is what's being introduced in the world of reform. Shorter services, English, decorum, confirmation, mixed seating, questions on the second day, use of instruments, initially Israel, rabbinic authority, competing synagogues, alternative organizations like Federation JFS, new prayer books, the universalization of Jewish values into larger picture values, women, the role of women, and the role of other demographics. All of that is, in a sense, what we take for granted, right? And yet it is all part of that sense of change from what came out of Europe. All right, we'll take questions and thoughts and ideas. Yes. And I'll repeat for everybody online.
Why was the service added?
All right, so the question is, why do we even have a Musaf service? Okay, so each of the services, the core of the service is the Amidah. Right? You've heard me say that on many occasions. The Amidah in each case replaced a sacrifice in temple times. On Shabbat, they did a second sacrifice. And so ended up Moon's addition. And so we replaced that second sacrifice with a second Amidah and therefore a Musaf. Okay? Any other comments or questions? Yes,
Yeah,
Suzanne.
as I'm listening to you, it sounds as if most of these reforms and changes that we as a conservative synagogue are familiar with actually had their origins in the reform movement in this country. Would I be correct in saying that, or did I mishear you?
So the comment, the observation is that as we listen to this, most of the changes that we are comfortable with in our conservative world had their origins in the founding of the reform movement. And that is correct. As a matter of fact, the conservative movement arises in response out of the reform movement, in response to specific issues. But you're correct in that a lot of these changes, they were Americanizational changes. And so the conservative movement has adopted many of them, more so in recent years. It keeps changing and keeps adding, but you're correct, in their source, they are reform in their nature.
Thank you.
Yes, Martin.
I wanted to make a comment about Kol Nidre, which is really fascinating. This is from a talk by Rabbi Rosen of Beth Yeshurun several years ago. Reform removed it, and one of the reasons they removed it is because of the comments about negating all vows. They thought that non-Jews would see this and not trust Jewish business people and so forth if they saw that in our prayer book we renege on our commitments.
Okay,
So they
yes,
took it out.
right.
But
So,
it disappeared from the service because the melody of Kol Nidre, as we all know, is what attracts people to the prayer, not the words. It's that
right.
tune. So the
So
next
the
verse,
conflict,
Pastor in Reform, put a note in, said, some congregations chant Kol Nidre here.
yes,
It
all
took
right.
till
So
the 1970s before Kol Nidre was put back into the Reform Machzor.
all right, hold on, Stanley. Let me respond, and let me repeat the comments as well to the people here. The basic comments is that yes, in the Reform movement, Kol Nidre was removed, and Rabbi Rosen gave a lecture. I gave a class on this as well a couple of years ago, stating that indeed it was removed because what the message of Kol Nidre is that we want to be released from vows that we have made. The Christian world perceives that then, that the word of a Jew has no value. They can be let out of their word. And so for centuries, it was used. It was used all over Europe as an attack on Jews. And so the rabbis of the Reform movement said, let's get rid of it. The Nidre, however, is not in its words. If you look at it, it is literally a legal document. It is legal. There's a reason we repeat it 3 times, because that is the legal form. When you see something said 3 times, it's because it's a legal statement. The power of Kol Nidre is in its music. It is in a musical mode that is unique and distinct to Western music. And as what you saw in the Reform movement, they took that melody at some point and they put it on other words. But nonetheless, it's been one of those cases where the popular vote overruled the rabbinic ruling. And you'll see today, it's made its way back into most Reform prayer books, or as Martin said, sometimes what you'll see is some congregations chant Kol Nidre. Right? Today, if I say to you, Yom Kippur, what's the first thing that comes up? Fasting is the first thing that comes to mind. The second is Kol Nidre. Right? All right, Stanley.
Being a member of Beth Israel for 50 years and being coming to morning minyan every day, it's a very different thing. But I've seen this over the years, as well as people I know from Beth Israel that have been members way before me. And some of the changes made where they were living in Texas, people who lived here in 1924, when the Ku Klux Klan was very active, they felt that if they said, I'm going to my church, the Klan may understand that, but they would never say, I'm going to a temple or a synagogue. It's just how they were to protect themselves in the city. But as far as the book, the Union Prayer Book, the Black Book, people used that until the Gates of Prayer came out in the 70s. And that changed a lot and a lot of older members, I'd say 500 to 1,000 of the members never accepted the changes made. And it took Rabbi Carr all his years to make very subtle changes. I mean, from letting people come in with a Yamahi and Beth Israel to other changes, but it took his 25 years to do that.
Okay. So the changes in the Reform movement have been subtle, and there's been a reverse back to a little bit more tradition, is the gist of what he's saying. And now you have the idea you can allow somebody with a kippah into the synagogue. I know Temple Emmanuel in Dallas for years had a choir director, Simon Sargon, and they had a choir and no cantor. And when they decided to hire a cantor, it was a war. It was a war. Okay, that's not reform. We don't do that. Wearing a kippah is not reform. Wearing a talit is not reform. We don't do that. You're seeing a shift back. For lots of reasons, and we can get into the movements at another time. I don't want to get too
And
deeply into that.
that's
topic.
also why what Martin brought up about the prayer for Israel. It
Right.
took, I mean, obviously in the 40s, I know people who voted. That's why Emmanuel broke away.
Right. So the whole issue of Israel and the whole issue of the hope to return to a holy land, as opposed to turning this into our holy land, was a major issue of the 30s, the 40s, et cetera. And it really divided people for sure. You know, look, in the prayer book reform, I grew up with the Silverman Siddur. I have to imagine many people did. There's no prayer for the state of Israel in the Silverman Siddur because it was published in 1946. Okay. It is the Siddur I'm most comfortable with. If you look in my bar mitzvah notes when I meet with the kids, and I look for, you know, rather than writing Aleinu, et cetera, in my notes, what the kid did, you'll see 158. That's the page it was on in the prayer book. I know where it was, all right, because I grew up with it. And so, you know, say 158 kid gets an A, 158 kid gets an A. All the prayers are numbered rather than writing them all out every time I have. Kid would have no idea what I've written. And it's kind of deliberate. I don't want them to, you know, look over the shoulder and have any clue what I'm writing, all right, how I'm evaluating them. Yeah, prayer book reform, and it's become even more common. Look at our prayer books as they are today. The conservative movement went years and years and years and years without a prayer book change, and now it's like every 5 years there's a new prayer book. There's money to be made for sure, but with it comes new theologies, a reduction of the service. Each edition has less and less. You look at our Machzor, and you look at the Machzor that I used my first year as a cantor. I was working with Rabbi Simon Potok, and we sat down and we used the old Silverman Machzor, and it had like twice as much as we had today. And I remember sitting with him and saying, okay, let's talk, what are we doing? And he just said to me, yes, you're doing every page in the Machzor, do it. All right, we got out at 1 o'clock anyway, because my job was to move it. I could do the cantorial pieces, but everything else, when it came to davening, I was to fly. I learned a lot. Yeah. All right. Yes. Judith.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
You were.
I want to
yeah,
be sure
there
I
you
was
go.
unmuted. A
Yeah.
comment and a question. First comment is one of my cousins got married at Temple Emmanuel in, I guess, about 1980s. And my grandmother was still alive. She was Orthodox. She was the daughter of, and this goes back to what you were saying, here in Dallas at Tiferet Israel, they brought my great-grandfather and his family to Dallas. He was a reverend. He wasn't an ordained rabbi. He came from the Suwalk area of
Here.
Poland. Before that, they had a rabbi they shared with another congregation. But anyway, at Temple Emmanuel, my father and my uncle, her father, had to fight with the rabbi, I think it was Olin at the time, to be allowed to wear yarmulkes and to have a chuppah. They
Yeah. And that's at
finally-
Tiferet Israel, which at that time was a traditional congregation. She's talking about that they were fighting about kippot, et cetera. This is a
Oh,
synagogue.
no. That was at Temple Emmanuel, where my
Oh, at
cousin was
Emmanuel.
getting married.
Oh, okay.
But
Yeah.
she was the great-granddaughter of a rabbi, reverend, who was at Tiferet Israel.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And by the way, you're seeing the shift to the right as well, as you do at Tiferet Israel, or as you're seeing at UOS. All right. The rabbi who was at Tiferet Israel, Yitzchak Cohen, for many years, has been run out of the synagogue because they've gone far to the right. He wasn't, and I know that Rabbi Gelman had that struggle at UOS as well. He wasn't right enough. He was modern Orthodox. And so you're seeing this hardening. This is what Martin was introducing, is this concept of Orthodox term, but with it, a hardening in response to the more liberal movements.
Yeah,
What
Tiferet
was
Israel.
Orthodox in the past would not necessarily be considered. Yeah.
Yeah, Tiferet Israel.
And I
was
apologize, I'm
only-
going to have to run. I have another appointment.
Okay, then I have a question if you would address it the next session. And when we get to Texas history.
Is it a large picture question, or is it because I'm not going to have time for stories and responding
Okay,
to
no,
individual.
it's not. My question is about these rabbis who were starting Jewish schools, to educate the children. what was going on with education, like public
Right.
education at that
Right.
time in America. That for next time or whenever. Because were they getting a public education?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, they were. The answer is yes, they were. Yes, they were. A good day, everybody. A safe week. Let's play. By the way, no class the next 2 weeks. We meet again on the 14th. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you for a great class.
Thank you. Terrific class.